Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for these great webinars for CREST for the incident response. We are now on our fourth webinar for today, and we are looking at the future of incident response, and we have a great panel that will be looking at some of the questions we've already had sent in from some of you attendees, and obviously you do have the opportunity to ask some more questions, so please feel free to put those into the question pane, and our chair David Cannings will try and get through as many of those as we can today. So thank you very much again for attending, and I will hand over to David. Thanks, David.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this panel session. My name is David Cannings, and I'm from PwC as part of the incident response team. We've got a great selection of people here today from both consultancies, but also companies who obviously are increasingly the target of incidents. So if we can just go round in the order that's on that slide. Matt, would you mind introducing yourself?
I am Matt Gordon-Smith. I'm the CISO at Gatwick Airport. I've been there about a year and a half.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome. And Neil.
Hi, yep, I'm Neil Fowler-Wright. I head up information security for Hitachi Rail. And in fact, a couple of the attendees here will know me from my previous roles in finance and legal.
Good morning. Geoff.
Morning, I'm Geoff Jones, Director at Cyberis. I've been an incident responder for about 15 years now, so hopefully I can contribute to today's session.
Thank you. Morning, Andrew.
Hi there, I'm Andrew Jutson, Director at CyProtec. Previously CISO at TravelX, as well as Operational Risk Director.
And last but not least, Harry.
Hi, I'm Harry. I'm the Technical Director for the Incident Management team at the National Cybersecurity Centre. And I apologise for lack of surname. We're trying to recover from our spookiness, but surnames are still something that we're not allowed to share on the internet.
Great. And as Ali said, please do feel free to ask questions as we go through. We have got some that were asked in advance, which is great, and we'll start with those now, but the panel is on your GoToWebinar window. So it's tempting to start with just a very open-ended question about ransomware, which has been a problem and continues to be a problem for many of our customers and for many companies. But I think instead of that, we'll ask first, what has been the most surprising thing in the incident response space for you in the last 12 months? And Matt, how about if I hand that one to you?
I'm afraid I'm going to be very predictable, but not say it's necessarily surprising, but perhaps disappointing. Is obviously the SolarWinds event that occurred before Christmas, and the fact that we're still so reliant on third parties for delivering services, with the amount of trust that we need to put in those, and it's unfortunate when these things do happen. So yes, entirely predictable, I'm afraid, not surprising.
Anyone else? Certainly SolarWinds was a large event, I think, not necessarily constrained to that one company either, and definitely a risk for the entirety of our customer base. Harry, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that one.
I mean, I think that one's, I would probably agree that SolarWinds is the interesting one. I think it's the software supply chain part of that that's the really hard part. That, I don't think anyone's got any particularly great solutions to the, how do you deal with the possibility that somebody has, in a pretty sophisticated way, in the case of the SolarWinds attack, backdoored the update that you've deployed as part of good practice, patching. We're aware of some organisations that weren't affected by this because of the fact that their patching is terrible, which is not exactly a message that we want to be passing on to people. It's like, if you haven't patched since 2019, then you were safe from the SolarWinds attack, but really you should probably be patching more often. But I think it's probably going to be a big thing for the next few years is trying to get our hands around this whole software supply chain problem.
Absolutely. Anything else from anyone's reflections on things which you found surprising in the last 12 months? Great. In that case, I think we'll move to the next question, and that's more looking forward. What key challenges do we as a panel think that companies will face through the next year, through 2021? I don't know, maybe Andrew, if I could start with you on this one.
Yeah, sure. I think that a number of these things are going to be reasonably obvious, because it's often the attack points or continuation of the common attack points that are getting targeted, much like the sort of patching aspects and that protective maintenance kind of bar that isn't isn't there in many organizations and doesn't get the sort of necessary focus, as much as the SolarWinds one was a bit of an anomaly. I think social engineering is going to continue to rise. 2020 has been a profitable year for the attackers. So we're going to see potentially a continuation of those trends. So what else? I think broadly the competition that the sort of security change agenda plays into the business change agenda is going to be quite a substantial challenge. So it was already quite constrained. The business wants to make increases in revenue, and these tend to outstrip that sort of protective maintenance aspects. But then playing into how we can maintain and keep pace with the sort of business change, as well as the changes around the sort of security industry and what the attackers are doing, is going to be quite an interesting sort of play. I mean, from my own sort of visibility, some organizations have had significant challenges in just getting the basics right, in terms of getting outdated or legacy architecture just upgraded to a point where they can put in some of the newer sort of mechanisms to protect themselves. It's never an easy thing to do, and sort of playing into that kind of challenge is going to be, well, it's going to continue throughout 21, 22, etc.
Absolutely, and I think it's really interesting when we look at getting the basics right. There are some really simple things that I often trip over in incident response, such as knowing exactly what assets you have or how they're connected to each other, understanding the sort of scope of third parties who may have access to the network for legitimate purposes, to help do administration or to help run certain business functions, whether that's finance or IT or elsewhere. And obviously the account that you gave them or the RDP server you set up for them can equally be used by a threat actor, and some of those things can be a real challenge when you maybe rolled out an endpoint detection and response tool, or you've got a really great team, a CSAT team, to respond to run-of-the-mill business activities, and then you find that small 5% of the network, which is maybe not even controlled by you. And I think there was a fantastic mentioned in the first webinar of today from Mandiant, where they mentioned that a third-party server which had direct access to a network was used as part of the incident. So certainly some of these things remain challenges now, even though I think we've known about them for some years. I don't know if Matt, maybe, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to the thoughts so far.
Well, I mean, I think the impact of COVID-19 has had quite significant change for a lot of companies in the working practices. People working more flexibly, people being more remote. And I think especially for those organisations that potentially didn't have perhaps a particularly flexible work regime in the past, there's quite a not just a technology change, but a culture change for them as well. And as you mentioned, it's not just for the staff. For operational organisations where there are engineers coming in to do things locally, that standard preventative maintenance work that's always a person coming on site. Suddenly they realize that a lot of things they want to do remotely, and you're looking at that third-party ecosystem again. We've seen obviously a lot of more drive towards cloud services, mobility, mobile devices. Where is data? How is it accessed? Authentication systems, two-factor authentication will be a big push, and then we as the sort of cyber teams need to look at, well, how effective are our existing controls for a more mobile workforce? How are we going to get the information into these new systems? How are we going to consolidate that information in a useful sort of central place as well? And I think, as Andrew mentioned, phishing will continue to be a key issue, but a key vector. But I think there's, again, with COVID, there's more things now that you've got as a hook to bring people in with sort of vaccine invitations, furlough payment, tax refund type emails, travel health certificates, that sort of thing, which you sort of combine that with Brexit as well. So it's sort of a perfect storm of tempting emails that people can click on for how to achieve their problems. So yeah, there's lots of, well, there's a huge number of things, but they're sort of main on my mind at the moment.
I think there's a really interesting point just there. I'm sorry, Dave. Really interesting point just there about the kind of things people have done in response to COVID. One of the things that is worrying to us is around lots of organisations have rolled out home working solutions at quite rapid paces, and there's quite a lot of them who are going down kind of bring your own device routes because they didn't have people didn't have devices at home and things like that. And I wonder how many of those are going to find themselves bitten in the future when they have an incident and they haven't gone through some of the kind of boring, tedious legals around, well, can we now go and image someone's home system that is now a key part of the investigation that we need to do, but it's actually, that's their home computer, it's got their personal data on it. I worry that there's going to be some organizations that get bitten by that in the future, where instant response becomes a lot more difficult because suddenly you don't have any legal rights over some of the key devices that are being used as part of your IT estate.
Absolutely. I witnessed a fascinating discussion at a company where they found out that staff were using their laptops, which they were given for corporate use, for their children to do schoolwork, which obviously seems fairly benign. And this had been discovered by the IT department. And the HR department's sort of response was, well, that's not allowed. It's it's in our terms of use that they can't do that. So surely they wouldn't. And I guess incidents come when the computing world meets the real world. And some of those things like Brexit and like coronavirus obviously raise the risk profile, and we have to respond commensurately, I think. Geoff, did you want to add anything on that question?
Well, in respect to challenges I see coming up and trends that I've seen over the last 12 to 18 months, you've already mentioned the word ransomware, Dave, but I see ransomware changing from a commodity threat where it's fairly automated in the way that it infects and locks files, to more of an advanced persistent threat type intrusion where attackers may gain access to your network and move across the network looking for your critical sensitive data assets before launching the actual attack, and a more of a focus to extortion rather than just locking files. So not only is there an impact to availability of sensitive data assets, but also the confidentiality. For example, if you don't pay us the ransom, we'll not only prevent you accessing these files, but we'll also release them publicly. And I think that's a real challenge in the future, and certainly a trend that I've been seeing over the last 12 to 18 months.
Absolutely, and I think looking back, some of the surprising things perhaps are the lengths that the Information Commissioner in the UK has gone to in order to fine two very notable companies, for example, and the impact that's had certainly on some of the discussions that we've had during incidents where clients have put a lot more emphasis on discovering exactly what may have been stolen and the types of data, the types of document, and doing that data privacy impact assessment to make sure that actually when they submit to the ICO and they tell them that they've had an incident, they can say exactly what that is. And as Geoff said, the number of ransomware actors we've seen that are now releasing data, leaking data, doxing companies as part of that extortion attempt is growing, and I can't see that going away anytime soon. We've had one or two questions.
I was just going to say, we've definitely seen, sorry, I'm interrupting again. We've definitely seen the other part of that is people wanting to do their own impact assessments and not just worrying about the ICO, but like, what did they actually take and how bad is it going to be if they do publish it all on the internet? Because that's now such a common part of the ransomware attack. Actually, if, can organizations, do they have enough monitoring and logging that they can actually answer some of those questions for themselves is often the hard part.
Absolutely, and I think there's clearly a risk for the Information Commissioner, but another risk that may be coming up this year is that threat of group litigation or class action lawsuits, as they're called in the USA, and the fact that people will start to realize their data is something that people have to protect. So it'll be fascinating to see where that goes. We have had a few questions, thank you, and we'll come to those in a few minutes. If you do have a question, just a reminder, if you put that in the box, we will pick that up. But Neil, maybe if I could direct this question towards you, how does engaging with an insurer change the way you handle an incident?
So I think I need to advise everybody to take a big step backwards and talk to your insurers beforehand. Read your insurance policy. Of course, ideally have some cyber insurance, but it is really critical that whoever your crisis team, your incident management team understands the role that the insurers have. You've of course got a notification responsibility to them, but they've also got capabilities. They've got partners that they can use. They've got resources that they can call upon. And equally, you have to understand what it is you can and can't claim for. you can't claim for the efforts that your own teams put in. So that's effectively a huge area of potential non-recovered costs. But equally, it's very important to understand what you do and don't tell the insurers, and that's, I'm not talking here about covering anything up or not, but it's whether or not the insurer will interpret something as, say, an act of war rather than an act of ransomware. I suspect we'll probably get onto the question of attribution at some point, but the insurers and yourselves have got to have a really good relationship to be able to work through an incident properly. I hope that makes sense to people, but it's quite a complex area and it does need some research, and your crisis team needs to understand that relationship.
Absolutely, and I think there can often be perhaps a loss of control maybe of that process when an insurer is involved, and the fact that they now run the incident and will be responsible in some cases for choosing, as you mentioned, Neil, what third parties, whether that's a technical response company, whether it's a crisis communications agency, maybe a law firm that the insurance company wants to work with. And as Neil said, I think understanding those things up front is critical really to making sure that you want to work with those partners, and that if the worst did happen, you would feel confident with them coming in and running that portion for you. It's obviously a business risk.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend. Sorry, I'd strongly recommend you sit down with your insurers beforehand and say, these are the partners that we've got. Under an incident, would you be accepting of us working with them? This is what a typical statement of work looks like. This is what their costs look like, and effectively do a tabletop exercise with the insurer.
Absolutely, and yeah, I think having those your selected third parties and working with them up front, certainly in my experience, works much better than calling your insurance company and hoping they send someone reputable when you actually have an incident. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything on the insurance side, which is definitely growing here in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, from just building on what Neil said about how the insurance company sort of determines or categorizes the type of incident. Again, the lesson from COVID is the challenges, the legal challenges on the business interruption insurance that a lot of companies are facing around whether they had cover for the pandemic or whether it was specifically within their terms or not. As Neil says, it's very important to check your terms and conditions. I think when when cyber insurance first came out, it was quite limited in terms of its cover, but certainly what we're seeing now is not just a lot of variation in the type of cover you can get, but obviously specific exclusions in the non-cyber policies for cyber attacks. So it's getting that join between what's excluded from your other incident and interruption insurance that is explicitly covered in your cyber insurance. And I think the question around how that affects how we handle an incident, again, part of that cost of premium will depend on that insurer's perception and your responses to the maturity of your organization and your ability to respond, the ability to detect and contain. So part of that response might also include being able to demonstrate that you've lived up to the claims you made when you took out that insurance in terms of your own maturity and capabilities. So I think that's an important thing to consider as well.
Absolutely, and as Neil said, that's not time that you will be paid for. So having that prepared in advance, I guess, is very important, and making sure you can be robust about demonstrating that when you're making a claim. And some of those claims, I'm sure, are in the multi-millions of pounds. And something very surprising for me has been the number of insurers who will consider paying the ransom, actually, because that is a lower barrier to recovering your data and restoring your business than perhaps a very lengthy backup recovery, which may not work. And I think, I don't know if we'll come on to this later, but we've seen organizations like OFAC in the USA effectively designate some of these as groups that cannot be paid. And that removes an option from the table, which I'm sure none of us would recommend or wish that companies would take. But obviously companies do occasionally pay in order to secure their data. So that's definitely a change. Maybe, Geoff, if I could come to you on this next question, what changes do you foresee happening in the incident response space and the way that we go about it?
I'm actually going to completely contradict my previous comment here. So I think actually with the advancement of EDR tools and XDR tools, the investigation and response and recovery to an incident is actually becoming a lot more commoditized, very much like the threat is actually. So if I can give you some examples, if you look at EDR tools, you've got automated network isolation, you've got automated investigation, collection of evidence. You've even got automated rebuild in most MDM solutions. And I think the time to investigate the investigation component of a incident is actually much more commoditized, as is the recovery. And I think time to recovery is much quicker as a result. So I realise I'm contradicting my earlier answer a little bit there in terms of ransomware is becoming less commoditized, but I do think our ability as responders to use the modern tools available to us is actually streamlining the process a lot.
And Geoff, just to follow up on that, what would your recommendation be to companies around things like EDR tooling? I know in my experience, many companies will invest in that after an incident when budget is typically more available, but how is it more effective if that happens beforehand? Or
so if I wind back the clock to like 10 years or 15 years even, we used to have very perimeter focused detection, intrusion detection systems, which were extremely noisy. We had antivirus products that weren't particularly sensitive in picking up intrusions, because if you have false positives, people lose confidence in those tools. With modern EDR tools, you have a full log of absolutely every activity, whether it be a registry read or write, a network connection, a file creation, or whatever it might be. You've got full logging at the endpoint, the place where an intrusion may occur. With that level of detail and the ability to immediately respond and isolate a network asset, it greatly reduces the impact of any intrusion. So in response to your question, it's most definitely the way forward. And the big vendors have already realized this. I won't name vendors on this particular panel, but I'm sure most people attending this can name a few common EDR tools, all of which have that type of functionality inbuilt. And if you compare it to the olden days of traditional AV and IDS, we're in such a better place as an industry.
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting how some of those agents are now looking to take over the space of other traditional tools, whether that's monitoring for updates or applying configuration consistently in the MDM space.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of these EDR tools today, do some of the functionality that a traditional vulnerability scanner will, and asset management as well.
And from a sort of perspective of a company using or buying these tools and having to sort of consider that very large investment, I don't know, Neil or Andrew or Matt, is there any reflections on how you see that changing the way you respond to incidents?
Yeah, I think, and it also goes back to the skills you might leverage from the insurer. The complexity of the EDR tools, that the capabilities of them has grown so dramatically that actually the place for the internal IT team in an incident is significantly diminished, and that goes back to the point of control. In many cases, is the insurer, is the EDR supplier, or is the company affected actually the one controlling the incident? It does, I think, significantly change the incident response space.
Yeah, I think my feelings on the sort of the end user side and the difficulty that I've seen in the perception of EDR, though, has been that some people just regard it as sort of the next small step up from the previous version of AV that they've had, rather than what EDR is, which as Geoff and Neil, you both said, is a far more data rich and capable solution. And certainly what we're seeing sort of from the EDR world, also from the ISP world, is those additional incident response capabilities that they either include with their service or they sell as additional services to bolster and run on their own sort of knowledge of their service, to say we can support you in the event of an incident, and maybe even pitch it in terms of hours or capabilities. I think the third party thing as well, coming back to not just to SolarWinds, but also looking at how do we include our third parties in that incident response process, with so many more third parties part of that data ecosystem and therefore part of the risk. You need to look at, well, how do we interact better with them? How do we ensure that it's not just a contractual clause that says, we will contact you on this email address or phone number if there's an incident, and you will respond in X hours. That there's far more of an integrated response approach for those third parties. And also, the issue that was brought up with SolarWinds was you want to make sure that the life cycle of vulnerability management of your systems is maintained at a good level. And what the SolarWinds incident sort of brings to light is, well, actually there's a risk of patching as well as a risk of not patching now. So how do you ensure that monitoring for the activity of those systems can be achieved without compromising the patching? I don't know if it's worth, I've had some thoughts sort of on the wider incident response and the wider business. I don't know if you want me to go into that or whether we'll
no, go for it. I think if we've got one more minute, go for it.
Well, I mean, it was just really just to think about as well as sort of the opportunities within the sort of IT and cyber side, is a greater interconnection between the information security cyber IT team and the wider business, because certainly there are incidents, particularly in an operational environment, that could be caused by a cyber attack that perhaps wouldn't be detected if it's happening on one of those systems that's outside of our sort of scope of monitoring, scope of view. To also look at what the wider business impact is, not just of the incident itself, but some of the response remediation actions that may need to be taken, and taking the opportunity to look at where there's a wider incident management scenario training and exercising regime in place, that cyber is part of that we know how we might react in a wider business incident, but also how the wider business needs to react when there's a cyber incident, that this isn't just an IT piece. And I think what that gives us is greater visibility of cyber attacks at the sort of board exec level, certainly given the level of publicity they've got recently, which produces the challenge to us to say, well, give us some metrics on what we're seeing specifically for us, or give us some metrics for the industry, give us some metrics for how we compare to other companies. So actually the part of that incident response demand won't just be on how we do it, but how we prepare for it and how we demonstrate our level of maturity in the industry. I think that's a sort of a wider business side of that.
Absolutely, and I've spoken to companies where they've had ransomware attacks and they've had to fall back on manual procedures for things like unloading trucks or shipping out inventory, and for them obviously that is a much bigger business problem. And one customer remarked they were very lucky they had staff that had been with them since before they had computers and knew how to do all those things manually, but in many organizations, falling back on manual processes when we rely on computers to do 1,000 things a second is very tricky. I'm going to turn now to a question we've been asked. I'll offer just a quick few thoughts while everyone else thinks about it. The question is, how many times have we seen organizations pay a ransom? And has it ever happened and the data not being decrypted? I can't comment necessarily on volume or how many I've seen. I've definitely seen companies pay. And what I can say though is, threat actors don't like to undermine their business model. They will consistently give you an executable or a mechanism for recovering data, but they definitely don't make that easy at scale. So the thought of restoring data on 25,000 PCs that have been ransomwared with a single Windows executable is a very tricky process and is not something the threat actors will want to do for you, even for the many £1 million fee sometimes that is demanded. So I don't know if anyone else has any reflections on sort of the paying of ransoms and that business model.
Just very briefly on that last comment, I had a small bit. The decryptors are definitely not enterprise-grade software, like the ones that we've seen where, for example, you have to press enter to start, which means that actually trying to deploy it at scale across the entire estate is quite difficult, because you've got 25,000 machines and you now need to press enter on every single one of them. They definitely haven't thought through some of the decryptors look a lot like they were designed for home use, home user environments, and haven't really thought through if you're trying to do this at massive scale, like, can I get an MSI? Can it run silently in the background? There's definitely not any of that. The amount of work you have to put in to, even if you pay the ransom, to actually recovering it. Also, there are a reasonable number of cases we've seen where, I think the ransomware crews are getting more careful about this, but where they've, although the data is recoverable now in theory, they've actually broken your systems because your database didn't enjoy having its files encrypted whilst it was still running, and you now have a whole kind of data recovery problem and things like that. And then also just some weird interactions where, yes, they've given you the decryption application, but it turns out that some other part of your system has broken it somehow. So antivirus has cleaned up the ransom notes or something like that, and therefore those have got the kind of half of the part of the key in them and things. There's all kinds of things that go wrong in this space.
Absolutely. Any other reflections?
Dave, is people do often pay ransoms. There are indeed there are companies that specialize in negotiating ransoms on behalf of companies. So a lot of people do pay. If you're not ready for a ransomware, it sounds obvious, but if you're not ready for a ransomware incident and you haven't got backups that you can recover from in a speedy way, it may often be the cheapest way of recovery, as you mentioned before.
Just on the backups one, sorry, I should have mentioned it earlier, but the other one that we see way too often is people who don't have any offline backups or kind of, we keep seeing cases where people have had, they've got all of their backups there, they're all very happy with it. If one site went down, they'd be able to recover, etc. But they're backing up onto another domain joined computer, and when the ransomware gets deployed to every domain joined machine, it encrypts your backups as well, at which point you are completely out of luck. They're apart from paying the ransom, you're not going to be getting that data back anytime soon.
Yep, we've definitely seen cases where organizations have named their PCs, backup 1, backup 2, and that's fantastic. It makes it very easy for the IT operations team, but it also makes it very easy for the threat actor to quickly enumerate your network and find out where they are. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge. I don't know if Neil or Andrew or Matt, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I just wanted to add something around, and particularly around, we've sort of slightly flippantly thrown around perhaps the cheapest option, but as I think Harry demonstrated, the ransom may only be a couple of $100,000 or however many bitcoins that is today, but that cost of going around machines, that cost of, okay, that didn't work, I've still got to go and do the recovery, is probably many times whatever the ransom is. So it's not a linear piece. And back to insurance, because obviously we've had that question already, these things aren't covered. So you cannot claim your ransom back under insurance, and if after you've paid the ransom and you're doing the recovery, you're expending internal effort to do the recovery, that's also not claimable. So you effectively still get hit multiple times for increasing cost.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn to another question now from the audience. Thank you. A slightly more contentious one, perhaps, that I'm sure we could do 45 minutes on its own. And Harry, maybe I'll throw this to you first, but what is the value of attribution, either to a threat group or to an individual, when we're doing incident response?
And yeah, as the representative of gov.uk, I can see that I'm going to get this one. I think it's an interesting question around, particularly around those details of attribution to an intrusion set, attribution to an actual group, and whether or not that group is related to any other kind of, are they connected to a foreign country or things like that. There's certainly a huge amount of value I've seen in incident response in attribution to an intrusion set, to be able to say, these are the other IOCs, TTPs, etc. This is the sort of thing they're likely to be going after. These are the sorts of actions they might take next. Does this intrusion set have any history of destructive activity, or are they likely to be stealing money or going after information, or all of those things? What sorts of things should you be looking for is all enormously useful in incidents. I'm personally less convinced that in the incident response space, the kind of attribution to an actual group of people is as valuable in a lot of cases. It doesn't really matter to me when I'm dealing with an incident exactly where their desk is. I'd like to know what their likely motivations are and things like that. But whether or not they sit in a building in Bognor Regis or in another country, it doesn't make any difference at all to actually what I'm going to have to do in the incident in most cases. And as was mentioned earlier, there is some interesting stuff around whether attribution, particularly by governments to certain groups, can then cause issues with things like insurance, and whether this is covered by cyber insurance. There is also sometimes, it niggles me a bit, but there's this thing where organizations like to be able to say that they've been targeted by a sophisticated attacker, because it makes them, they think that it means that people will think that they couldn't possibly protect against it. But in a lot of cases, those sophisticated attackers aren't necessarily having to kind of flex their muscles in order to get in. This may be some nation state actor, but if all they did was send you some phishing emails with macros in a Word document, that's not really, that's the same thing that anybody else could have done. Just because they happen to be, someone who could have done worse, doesn't mean that you get a free pass from me. I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that.
I see, as an incident responder, it's more like being a paramedic. You're there to help, investigate, recover from the immediate incident. As if you liken it to being a paramedic, if somebody's got a knife sticking out of them, you don't really care how that knife got there. You're dealing with the immediate situation and the recovery from that. Attribution may be important down the line, but as an incident responder, I think it's not so important whilst you're actually dealing with the incident.
From my perspective, being sort of in the hot seat, if you like, managing an incident from my previous days, there was always, I suppose, the average point, there was always that, who is attacking us, who is coming after us, who's doing these sort of bad things to us. So there has been, certainly in my experience, a want to know, because it's almost, knowing who burgled your house or who sort of nicked your car. There's that sort of emotional level that people, certainly sort of senior management, senior executives, etc., want to know that sort of information. Whether it holds much in the way of value, I suppose, other than knowing their MO and what might come after, that's always useful information.
Definitely, that personal aspect in incidents is always very prominent. When a board member obviously takes it seriously but just wants it to be dealt with, and actually then when their email is read or their interactions are accessed by an attacker, it often becomes a lot more personal, and the decision is that it must end now.
Putting my consultancy hat on for a moment, trying to manage the client's expectations is always very important. Being upfront that attribution may not be possible, in fact is unlikely to be possible during an incident, is very important. As I say, there is often a desire to understand who is attacking an organisation, as Andrew and Harry said, but being there first on scene, your primary focus is to respond to that incident and recover, rather than trying to work out who it is.
Agreed. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to ask a rapid fire question to Neil, maybe another contentious one. Having talked about EDR agents and the sort of modern technology we do have, in 1 minute, Neil, what place does digital forensics have in incident response nowadays?
I think the answer is a diminishing one. The days of going through every single machine to go and get all the little nuances of everything that's been done is almost gone. I think early on in there, you obviously want to get a huge amount of data out of EDR and use that to write the rules. But probably the first few machines, or maybe a centralized machine that's acting as a command and control, those are the boxes where you want to spend that resource. So it's not something that's going to go away. It's not something that's dead. It is key, but it's no longer the answer to everything. It's no longer a case of shipping off 30, 40 hard drives and waiting a month for the responses to come back. It's a targeted resource. It has its place. It's targeted.
Absolutely. I think it's a key skill that definitely is necessary. We mentioned earlier data privacy impact assessments and understanding in detail in some cases what's happened. But as you very rightly said, I don't think you can roll out forensics to 400 machines that have all been accessed by an attacker with PS exec or other tools. So another one for maybe a minute or less, and Matt, I don't know if you could start. We've seen an increase in sort of public breaches, or whether it's the mainstream media, whether it's leak sites from threat actors, and organizations effectively not having that time to control the sort of message or do their own homework before things become public. What increased sort of risk does that have for your type of organization?
Well, I mean, as with any organisation, there's the reputational risk of just that information or just that claim being out there in the public arena, but also the accuracy of that. If you want to try and sort of refute and respond as quick as possible, but also if that information isn't correct or is or has falsities in it elsewhere, that's an issue. Obviously, the level of detail that's in that sort of publicity could leave you exposed to future attacks, and you might need to sort of reconsider, well, where do we need to shore up elsewhere, because actually this has exposed things that potentially that company wasn't aware of as well. And I know we've mentioned previously the increase in class action lawsuits for personal data breaches. It seems to be quite popular now. I seem to see adverts on the TV for them now, and pop-ups on various websites for, are you sure you haven't been involved in this breach? And we're going to try and get two grand for every person who's had their data stolen. And that seems like quite a risk. And again, there's coverage for insurance for that, but then not all insurance.
Absolutely. And again, I'm really conscious of time. We've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to turn to each of you now just for a closing thought, maybe in 30 seconds, something that either you'd like to reflect on that we've talked about, or something you think people should definitely take away. I'm not going to pick on anyone. Would anyone like to volunteer to go first for a closing thought?
Yeah,
just from
re-echo what I said before. Talk to your insurers, do a tabletop, go through your insurance and just work, understand how you would run an incident, because you don't want to be on the back foot, whether it's because of media leak, as Matt just answered, or a detected event. You've got to know what you're doing and what resources you can call upon.
Andrew.
My point was going to be the same. I suppose it's don't underestimate how useful sort of scenario planning is. Look at the value that the tools you've got at your disposal are. I suppose taking the point that Geoff raised before about the sort of containment sort of features that these tools have, I don't think currently organizations have the confidence to use them until it's like hit the big red button moment. I think there's a time and place to scenario plan that in to an activity, perhaps demonstrate what the feature set of the tool set can do and how you can actually use it in the wild, if you like, in the sort of heat of the moment.
Thank you. Geoff, maybe?
Just expand on that as well. So rather than looking for the known bad like traditional AV and IDS, invest in EDR up front, have those tools available, that very rich data set, as Matt said before, so you can actually respond to an incident when one unfortunately does happen. And I'll just say one more thing as well on the class action lawsuits that Matt just mentioned. I've been involved in a few of these very recently, actually, for a number of our clients, and it's interesting to see that many of the data subjects they put forward in these class action lawsuits have actually turned out to not being involved in the original breach. So this is very important from a client's perspective to actually validate the lawsuits and the data subjects which have supposedly been affected.
Absolutely. Harry, do I want to ask you to go next?
So I think you kind of led with it, but I was going to just mention on the ransomware point, like, I think it's really important that people get the message that the ransomware groups are out there targeting absolutely everybody. In the last year, we've had attacks on multinationals, small businesses, government departments, charities, absolutely everybody, making sure that you've got, some sort of way of recovering from this, making sure that, you have some offline backups, and also making sure that you know whether or not you've got RDP exposed to the internet somewhere. The number of cases that we're involved in where it turns out that somebody left RDP open to the internet and someone just brute forces an account on there and comes in through that. Please try not to have that, because that's just going to be embarrassing when that happens.
Absolutely. And Matt, in 10 seconds.
Yeah, so very quickly, just my opening thoughts on the changes that COVID has brought. Think about where your data is, where your people are, how they're working, what changes have happened in the last year, and which are going to continue, how that affects how you're monitoring, visibility you've got, how you respond, and everything else that sits around that.
Absolutely, and I think my closing thought, to expand on the metaphor that Geoff started earlier around us being paramedics, absolutely, we are there to come in and to help at the very last minute when it's all gone wrong, but all of the providers would prefer you use just like an annual medical, to engage with us throughout the year and to work with us effectively to make sure that hygiene and that kind of all the things that help an organization to stay secure are in place. And it won't prevent incidents completely. It won't, unfortunately, always prevent ransomware, but it will definitely lessen the impact. It will mean you respond much more quickly, and in terms of business risk, it will massively reduce it. So from there, I'm going to say thank you to all the panelists. Thank you very much to everyone that joined. And Ali, back to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to our panel. It's been absolutely brilliant just listening to all those questions coming in, and thank you so much for answering those today. Really, really interesting session. I'm sure we could have run on for about another hour and a half, and perhaps we may have to encourage our panel to come back for another session. I think there's probably some more questions that could be put to them. So thank you once again, and thank you for all our attendees, and thank you for all the questions that you've put to our panel, and hope everybody has a good rest of the day. We have still got some more webinars running throughout the day, so please feel free to attend any of those as you wish. So take care and have a good day. Thanks, everyone.